Greetings. I'm Dr. Jason Ozuko from the Psychology Department at SUNY Geneseo, and welcome to my online course in PsychoPy. This course is a multi-part series that will teach you how to use PsychoPy to build experiments for both in-person and online research. We're going to be covering everything from how to get started with PsychoPy to how to build your first experiment, all the way up to advanced features, including things like scripting. And so even if you've never heard of PsychoPy, by the end of this online course, you should have a pretty good handle on what it is, how to build experiments, and how to do research with it. And so with that said, let's get started here today with an overview of PsychoPy. Now, I've got PsychoPy open in the background here, but before we actually dive into taking a look at it, I wanted to show you where you get PsychoPy. This is the PsychoPy website, psychopy.org. Here you will find not only PsychoPy itself, but lots of good resources and forums. And so here's the welcome page to PsychoPy. PsychoPy runs experiments both in lab and online, as you can see. And it's just a very handy piece of software for running experiments. Clicking on the Install tab, as I did there, will bring you to a download area. And PsychoPy should detect your operating system and offer you the relevant installation file to download. They're providing you with the most recent stable build, so you can go ahead and click to install whatever the most current version of PsychoPy is by the time you watch this video. For me, it's version 2021.2.1. There are also other instructions here if you would like to install PsychoPy on other systems, for example, Linux systems, or if you want to use the pip install. For me, because I'm using a Windows-based computer, I can simply click on the standalone and install the software. Now, as I have already installed PsychoPy, we're going to skip watching me install it, and we'll get to taking a look at the software itself. So this is PsychoPy, and I should start by saying that there are actually different views in PsychoPy. So if you click on your window menu, you will see that there is a builder, a coder, and a runner. What I'm looking at here is the builder view, and this is the view that we're going to be focusing on for the remainder of our tutorials. However, it's handy to understand what these other views actually are. So what the builder view is an abstraction of your experiment. Down at the bottom here is a timeline, and we'll talk more about this timeline momentarily, but on this timeline are going to be different routines, and each routine represents a section of your experiment. For example, a welcome screen, a trial, an end screen, and so on. And so this flow, this timeline flow down here allows you to visualize the different stages or steps of your experiment. Now, again, this is an abstraction. Computers can't actually understand this abstraction and execute it as an experiment. Instead, the way PsychoPy works is after you build your experiment in the builder here, it will actually compile it into code. And this is where the coder window comes in. So this is the coder window in PsychoPy. Sometimes when you open up PsychoPy, you will be brought just to the coder window. And if you're unfamiliar with PsychoPy, you might think, how do I get to the actual part where I build my experiment? Well, if you're very handy in Python scripting, you can actually code an entire experiment in here by creating a new file and writing Python code right in this text area here. A complete experiment that PsychoPy will actually generate for you will look something like this. And so you can see you need to know quite a bit about coding in order to be able to produce something like this. Now, you're not going to be required to understand this code in order to follow these videos that I'm producing here. I just wanted to show you what's happening with PsychoPy so that you understand how this program works. So if you start up PsychoPy and you end up in the coder view, simply click on the window and click to builder, and you'll be brought to the builder that you actually want to be working with predominantly. And you can minimize the coder view. The one other window is the runner window, and you can get to it by selecting window and then runner. This window will come up when you try to run an experiment, and it will show you a list of recent experiments and give you options to run them online, or do various other things. For our purposes, the runner window is also going to be where we see output. So when you have errors in your code, or if you put debug statements to print out maybe the value of variables so that you can track to make sure your code has been programmed properly and has the correct values behind the scenes, all those output statements are going to appear here. And it's very handy to know where to look to see where error messages are going to be presented. And we'll eventually look at how do you interpret error messages and find problems in your code. A few other things in the menu here before we carry on. If you want to run experiments online, you need to create a Pavlovia account. So you'll separately have to go to pavlovia.org and sign up for an account. And then under user, you will have to go and log into Pavlovia in PsychoPy. You can see I have a few logins here. When you click Login to Pavlovia, a window will come up, and you simply log in with the credentials you've created on Pavlovia, and this will make sure that PsychoPy can eventually upload experiments. In this window, in this menu is where you will also see options to create a new experiment, and we will explore that as we build our first experiment in our next video. Other handy features here include create a new experiment, open an existing experiment, save your experiment, which is very handy. You have some undo and redo options. You also have experimental settings here. And this is where you can do things like give your experiment a name, but also add startup parameters. So when you start your experiment right now, we're going to be asked for a participant number, and by default, nothing will be there, and we'll have to enter one. And we'll be asked what session this is. These are common startup parameters in most psychology experiments, participant number and session. You can add more if you'd like by simply clicking plus, and you could, for instance, add maybe a gender parameter if you wanted to track that, or a handedness if you wanted to know about whether your subjects were left or right-handed. You can also remove parameters by clicking the minus. Now, it is recommended that you never remove the participant or the session parameters, because if you do so, you can interfere with the way that PsychoPy tries to log data. As we will see, data tends to be logged using the participant ID, and in this case, the date and the experiment name. Now, you don't typically have to come and mess with any of this, but if you would like to change how PsychoPy is logging data, you can change things to saving Excel files, saving summary files, and so on. There's a tab for extra online functionality, which we will take a look at again in later videos. But the only other option I wanted to show you today was the option to run your experiment in full screen or windowed. So by default, your experiments run in full screen, and when you run your experiments for real, you should be running them in full screen. However, when you are developing experiments, it's actually handy to turn this feature off, because when you are developing an experiment, sometimes you will be, again, outputting comments to yourself as the experiment runs behind the scenes. And if your experiment is in a window, then you'll be able to see your comments in the output area of the runner. So developing experiments in windowed mode is often just easier and simpler than developing them in full screen. You can leave it as full screen if you like. As a habit, I tend to switch these to windowed, and then you can also type in the size of the window you want to be working with. And I find you don't want the window to be too big. You just want enough to sample to see what subjects will see, and then you also want to see what's going on in the background in other windows. You can also, by the way, affect different default parameters of your experiment here. So as we'll see, PsychoPy tends to run on a gray background, which is color 0, 0, 0. If you would like PsychoPy to run on a black background, you can change this to 1, 1, 1. If you'd like a white background, I believe it's -1, -1, -1. And you can also do things like have the mouse cursor appear. We'll leave the rest here as default, as I just wanted to show you that's where your project settings are. The other buttons up here include a Run Experiment button, which is what you use to run the experiment locally. There is a Run the Study Online button, which is how you run the study online. And then there is a Sync Online, which will sync your experiment online, but not actually run it. So it just takes all the code you've been working on your computer and sends it to the internet. There are some other options here for finding existing studies online if you would like to find some samples. Here's another login button, and this views the details of your project. So those are the major menu areas of the PsychoPy software itself. Now let's focus on actually the components of an experiment. So as I said down here under flow, this is your timeline of your experiment. Right now we have a single trial. And this itself is called a routine. So in your flow, you can insert routines and loops. We're going to start by looking at routines. I would like my experiment to begin with a welcome screen. So if I click on Insert Routine, I can select New, and I can insert a welcome screen. Now I'm given an option of where to insert this, and there's only two options, before trial or after trial. I'm going to insert it before the trial. Now I have a routine called welcome screen. I'd also like a routine called the goodbye screen, where I tell subjects the experiment is over. So I'm going to insert a new routine as goodbye and insert it at the end. So I have a welcome screen, a trial, and a goodbye screen. Now let's imagine that I want to have 3 trials. Eventually we'll look at loops, but for right now I just want to show you that you can actually insert routines that already exist multiple times. So I can take a trial and insert it, and I can take another trial and insert it. Now again, this is not the way you would build a loop of trials. We will look at loops, but just to demonstrate the fact that you can insert the same routine multiple times. And perhaps a better example of this would be to create a blank period. Let's say that I want to have a 500 millisecond blank period. I'm going to call this blank 500. And so after subjects view my welcome screen and decide to move on to the experiment, I would like a brief blank period before the trials start. Then, after the trial is over, before the goodbye screen, I would like another brief blank period. So here I have 2 blank periods, which I will make 500 milliseconds long, that are separating my welcome screen from my trial and my goodbye screen. So that's how you create new routines, and that's how you insert them into your timeline. If you don't like a routine where it is, you right-click and select Remove. If you realize that a routine is not named correctly, you can right-click and select Rename, and we could rename this to something else. So blank 0.5, although PsychoPy doesn't allow decimals, so it changes it to an underscore. I'm going to rename this back to blank 500. So that's how you insert routines in the timeline, but how do you put things in the routine? We have a welcome screen, but I haven't actually added a welcome screen. There's a space for a welcome screen, but there isn't actually a screen itself. We have a blank period, but I haven't actually inserted any blank into my experiment. So how do I do this? Well, if you click on any one of these routines, note that you have your routines listed up here, and as I click on each one, it's tabbing between these. So you can either click on a routine that you want to edit, or you can find it up here in the list. And by the way, if you click the X, you will actually delete a routine for good. So if I X out trial, then trial not only gets erased from the timeline, but it doesn't exist anymore in my list of routines. So be very careful not to X off a routine that you want to keep. All your routines that exist will appear in this list, and you never want to X them off unless you actually want to get rid of them. So I'm going to create trial and put it back in my timeline. So let's start with the welcome screen. So I can either click on welcome screen here or click up here. And this is the welcome screen routine. Right now, it is totally blank. Note that my welcome screen routine has its own timeline. Right now, it's showing up to 11 seconds of time. Of course, there's actually nothing here at the moment. This brings us to the idea of components. Components are things that you can add to routines to have stimuli or responses in your experiment. So let's say that you want to show some text to subjects. Well, there is a component called text. This will show up under favorites, but if you unpack the stimuli section of your components list here in PsychoPy, you'll see that there's many different things we can show. We can show dots, we can show gradings, images, movies, polygons if you'd like to draw shapes to the screen, sounds, or text. Now we're going to focus on the most common components in this series. So today we'll be looking at text, images, and polygons, but in some later videos, we'll take a look at movies and sounds as well. So to add a component to a routine, simply have the routine selected and click on the component. Now you'll be brought to an options or properties menu where we can create properties for this new text object. So think about what we're doing. We're in the welcome screen and we're adding some text to that screen. So how about this be a welcome message? This is something you'll see in all of my videos as we move forward, but I'm a huge advocate of naming your items descriptively. Don't just leave the name of this text as text. It becomes very confusing later on when you're looking in your data file and you see things like a reaction time for text_4 or key press _7, and you think, God, what was that actually again? Just name your objects, name your components, come up with sensible names. Don't get lazy about it, because later on it will make your life a lot easier. You'll know what you're looking at when you're looking at data files. When you get an error message that text_7 can't show that variable, you won't have to search through your experiment looking for text_7. You'll just know what object it is that's causing the problems. So let's pause for a second and take a look at the properties here for our welcome text. We'll have text welcome message, actually. So first of all, we can have a start time. So this is saying, when in the welcome screen would you like the welcome message to appear? 0 means as soon as the welcome screen starts, this message should appear. If we change this to 1 or 2, what this would mean is once the welcome screen starts, our message wouldn't appear for 1 or 2 seconds. So you can actually delay things occurring in your routines by affecting their start time. So for instance, if you wanted, you could have 2 welcome screen messages. We could finish adding this message, and then we could add a second text message, and we could have the second one start several seconds after the first. So let's give that a shot. So this first message is going to appear immediately. We're going to have it appear for just 2 seconds, and we will say, welcome to the experiment. Now, let's just move on for right now. We'll take a look at these other properties in a moment. But there's our first welcome message. It occurs at the very beginning and it lasts for 2 seconds. I'm going to add a second welcome message, and I'll say welcome confirm, and I will say the experiment is about to start. Is that okay? And I will have this last for 5 seconds, and I will have this start at 2 seconds. So notice what I've done. The first message started at 0 and lasted for 2 seconds. The next message started at 2 seconds and lasted for 7. I could have had this second message start at 0, in which case they would have overlapped, or I could have it start at 2, in which case they are staggered. So this is a very simple experiment so far. Let's just see what it actually looks like. Now I'm going to run my experiment, but before I do, because this is a new project, I've got to save it. Now, when you are saving experiments in PsychoPy, it is best practice for each experiment to exist in its own folder. You shouldn't have a single folder that has multiple experiments in that folder. If you do, your experiments will probably run fine locally, but when you go to run things online, the first experiment that uses that folder that goes online will run okay. But the second experiment you try to put online out of that same folder is going to screw everything up. So for every experiment in PsychoPy, create a new folder and put that experiment in by itself. So we will call this our orientation experiment. And I will click save. Now I can go ahead and click run. Now this is going to bring up the startup parameters for our experiment. And if you recall, participant and session are what PsychoPy asks for by default. You could enter a participant number if you like. You can leave it blank. PsychoPy runs just as well in both cases. We'll just put subject 1 and we'll press enter. My experiment is running in windowed mode because that's how I set up the parameters. And notice that there was the welcome message and then it changed to my follow-up message. So that is how you add text objects to routines. Now let's come in here and get rid of my confirmation message. I'm going to remove this message. And let's just work with one simple message. So our welcome message, welcome to the experiment, and we will have this last for 5 seconds. Now, the other parameters that you can affect here are things like the position. So the position of the stimulus is by default 0, 0, meaning center the stimulus, or in this case, the text object, in the center of the screen. This 0, 0 is in X, Y coordinates, meaning the first number is the X position, the second is the Y position. And if you would like to move a stimulus on the screen, then you need to change these values. If you would like to move a stimulus to the left, then you want to give it a negative value. If you want to move it to the right, then you would give it a positive value for the first number. The second number represents the Y coordinates. Negative values if you want to move it down, positive values if you want to move it up. And so if we run our experiment again now, having changed the position to 0.5, 0.5, you will see that our welcome message has shifted to the right and has shifted up. And there is the message there. Notice that it's also being cut off a bit. And that's because we have moved the message essentially to the edge of the screen. So in PsychoPy, 0, 0 is center. And by the time you hit 1, 1, or 1, -1, or -1, 1, or -1, -1, you are basically reaching the edge of the screen. So everything is scaled essentially between 0 and 1. So you don't want your stimuli to appear at 23 and 45, or they'll be well off the screen. Of course, this is using the spatial units by default from the experimental settings, which scale things from -1 to +1. You can use a variety of spatial units. And so, for instance, you could do things in centimeters, in degrees. You could also do things in terms of pixels. So if you're familiar with the resolution of your screen, you can move things with pixel perfect precision. But by default, PsychoPy deals with these arbitrary units scaled between -1 and +1. You can also affect the orientation of your stimuli. So if you would like to rotate things, you can also mirror your stimuli if you would like to mirror things left or right or up or down. Notice that if you hover over a box, you tend to get a little tooltip that tells you how to work it. So if you'd like to mirror things horizontally, you type in horiz. If you'd like to mirror things vertically, you type in vert. Other options in the text component include things like the text of the color of the text, which by default is white. You can change this to black or green or whatever color you would like. You can also click on the color specifier, which is a little tool in PsychoPy that lets you sort of scale around and find a custom color and then copy that. And then you could come in here and paste what you've copied. And now this complicated number arrangement is actually the color that we just created. I think it was a purple color, but I'm going to change this back to white. You can affect the opacity. So basically, is your text see-through or not? By default, your text is opaque, so there's no value here, but it's a 1, essentially. But if you set it to 0, then your text is completely see-through. 0.5, it is semi-see-through. So you can affect the transparency of objects. You can also affect the text size. So by default, the letter height is 0.1. If you change this to 0.05, all the text will be half as tall. So the text will get smaller on the screen. You can make it 0.25 to make it a quarter of its default height. We'll make it 0.05 just so you can see it being a little bit smaller. You can change the font to whatever you would like. Any common font tends to work both online and locally. And then there are a few check boxes for things like saving the onset and offset times of this object, which you can just leave on by default. And if you are testing your experiment, sometimes there are components you want to turn off. You can come in and disable them, and then they just won't appear in the experiment until you re-enable them. But by default, you don't really need to be messing with any of that. Okay, let's look at another stimulus component, a common one, which are images. So let's go here into the trial and let's add an image. So just like with the text component, you simply go to the routine you'd like to add a component to and click on the component, and you will be brought up with its properties. We'll call this the image fruit because I'm going to be showing fruit images here in my sample experiment. Once again, You can affect the start time and the duration. Let's have fruit just appear for 2 seconds. You also have other parameters such as the position, just like you did with text. You can flip horizontally, flip vertically. You also have here the width and height of your stimulus. So again, these are in the same units as position. So 0.5, 0.5 will be essentially a quarter of the size of the screen, both in terms of width and height. In terms of appearance, you can change things like the foreground color, opacity, all the same things you could do with text, and a few other image-specific things, again, like size. But if we want to show an image, we have to select the image. So let's go ahead and click on the Specify File option. Now, I have added a folder to my experiment called Images, and in here I have 4 pictures of fruit. So let's just grab an apple, and I'm going to click OK. Now, just like with my welcome screen, where I have a welcome message and I see that it lasts for 5 seconds, on my trial, I see that I have a fruit and that it lasts for 2 seconds. So if I were to run my experiment now, what we would see is our welcome message for 5 seconds, followed by our trial, because we haven't done anything with our blank yet. Notice that the text has gotten smaller because I halved the text size, and there is my fruit. So showing stimuli is just that easy. Let's also add a polygon to our trial here. So I'm going to add a polygon, and I will call this a polygon stimulus. Now, our polygon is going to show up for the same duration as our fruit, so it will start at 0 seconds and last for 2 seconds, the exact same length as the fruit. There are different shapes you can select for your polygon. So by default, you could have a triangle. You could also have a rectangle, across, a star, a line, or a regular polygon where you get to specify the number of vertices you actually want. Let's leave things as a simple triangle. And in layout, you'll see some familiar properties. You can choose position, you can choose size, you can choose orientation if you would like to rotate it. We'll leave everything as default. However, I would like to change the fill color. Now, I could come into the selector and find a specific color, or I could just type in the word red. And that will give me a red triangle with a border that is white. And so we'll leave that as is. And everything else is fine, so I'm just going to click OK. And now we'll see what happens when I have a triangle and a fruit on the same trial. So my experiment begins once again with my welcome message. And notice now that I have my triangle, and it is over top, in this case, of my fruit. I'm going to make these last longer, actually. I'm going to make these last 10 seconds rather than 2, just for demonstration purposes. Now, you might ask, what if I actually wanted my fruit to appear on my triangle? You know, what if you want to have a polygon and an image, or 2 images, or images and text, all on the same slide, but you want to have one, you want to control which object appears on which. And so the draw order of PsychoPy is implied by the order in which you see things here in your routine. So essentially, PsychoPy begins every routine by drawing the first object here, and then the next object. So you might look at my trial and think, I've messed up. I put in fruits first, meaning that my polygon is always going to draw on top. So maybe I have to delete my trial, remake it, add my polygon, then add my fruit. You don't have to actually do that. If you right-click on any component in a routine, you can control where it actually exists. So for instance, maybe I want to move my polygon up such that it is now the first thing that is drawn and the fruit is the second thing that is drawn. If I were to run this experiment, what you will see now is that the triangle is behind the apple. And so by affecting the order in which you have components arranged in a routine, you can affect how they are drawn. And so this looks far better than the rectangle covering it. Of course, if you were doing an experiment where you want a rectangle to appear and cover your fruit, then you actually want to move this down. So if move down moves it down one step. Since I only have 2 items, it's hard to see, but I'm just going to add a dummy text thing here. So if I move to the bottom, the polygon always goes to the very bottom. Move to the top, it always goes to the very top. Move down, it moves down 1. and move up, it moves up 1. So you can move things up and down by just a single step. Now I'm going to remove this dummy text object. And now, with this simple idea of ordering your stimuli, of knowing how to draw images and text and timing, you could do things like if you wanted to have your image appear for, let's say, 3 seconds before being covered by a polygon. So maybe we want our polygon to appear at 3 seconds in and last for 7 seconds so that they both end at the same time. Now, if you run this experiment, what you will see is the fruit will only appear on the screen by itself for 3 seconds, and then shortly thereafter, a polygon will come and cover it up. So by controlling the order of draw and the timing of your stimuli, you can actually start to do some interesting things with PsychoPy. Now we can fill out the rest of our experiment here. So for our goodbye screen, we could add some goodbye text. And we could make this last for 5 seconds, and we could say thanks for participating. And we can actually add in these blank periods. So if you want a blank period in PsychoPy, in an empty routine, nothing happens. We've been running our experiment a few times now, and our welcome screen lasts for 5 seconds. Then our trial, there's supposed to be a blank period, but there's not actually a pause in the experiment. So how do we actually create a blank period? Well, what you do is you insert a component that shows nothing for the period that you want your delay. So it's very easy to insert, for instance, an empty text object. So we can insert a text component. We can delete the text that it is displaying and have it display nothing and have it last for 0.5 seconds. We will call this text blank 500. Again, remember, don't get lazy. Name your components, name your routines so that you know what they are later on. And that's all there is to it. If we run our experiment now, we'll see that there is a welcome screen, there is a trial. Between the trial, though, will be a 500 millisecond blank period, or half a second blank period. And same with after the trial ends, there will be a half-second blank before the goodbye screen. So here's our actual trial with our nice red triangle copying our fruit, and then thanks for participating. Now, so far, our experiment is not very interactive. We're simply showing things to subjects, and there's really nothing for them to do. They don't respond in any way. And so that brings us to the second major class of components, which are responses. And you can see under favorites, keyboard is one of the most commonly used responses. There are many different kinds of responses you can deal with. You can deal with everything from microphones to sliders to controllers to even buttons, which are a beta feature. We're going to focus on keyboards in this series of videos, but we will take a look at sliders and mice today, and they will come up in a few later videos. So first of all, let's say that maybe on our welcome screen, we actually would like subjects to have to press a button to start the experiment. So rather than just saying welcome to the experiment, let's also say press spacebar to begin. Now, in order to do this, we actually don't want our welcome message to end after 5 seconds. We want it to stay on the screen forever until spacebar is pressed. So I'm actually going to go back in, and rather than stopping at 5 seconds, I'm going to stop at nothing. When you have no number here, PsychoPy interprets that as forever, meaning it's never going to move past this screen. The way you actually get it to move past the screen, though, or one of the ways, is by adding an input that will end the routine. So we're going to add a keyboard component to this routine here by clicking on keyboard. We will call this the key welcome, so that we know that this is the key that is pressed on the welcome screen. Just like you did for text objects and images and polygons, you can affect when keyboard inputs are allowed. So you could maybe say a key can't be pressed until 2 seconds have passed, and once 2 seconds have passed, subjects only have 5 seconds to press a button. Obviously, you don't want that on a welcome screen, but depending on a trial that you're arranging, you may very well want to control when keyboard inputs are allowed. By default, typically when you're inserting a keyboard component, you want it to be something that subjects can do immediately when the routine starts, and you want it to be an option that they can engage in for the entire duration of the routine. So we're going to start it at 0 seconds and have it last forever. Next, we have this handy checkbox that says Force End of Routine. What this means is that when a key is pressed, the routine, so the welcome screen, will end. And that's precisely why we're adding the keyboard. So this is fine. You can leave this checked. As we will see in more advanced videos, sometimes you don't want this checked because, for instance, you want a trial to last for a set duration of time. Maybe you want to show a stimulus to subjects for 5 seconds each. And as the stimulus is on the screen, subjects can make a response, but you don't want that response to end the trial prematurely. You want all your trials to nonetheless last 5 seconds. In that case, you would uncheck Force End of Routine so that subjects can still make a response. It will get logged, but it won't end your trial early. So this will depend on what you want the keyboard response to do in terms of ending or not ending your trial. For us, we wanted to end the welcome screen. Now we have a list of allowable keys. So by default, Y and N for yes and no. Left or right are the arrow keys, left or right. Spacebar. You can also have things like return if you want subjects to press return. It is advisable to never use escape, ever. The reason being is because escape is a special key that you can use to exit PsychoPy. So when you're running a PsychoPy experiment, if you need to quit it early, you press escape. That works both for local and online. So if you do add escape as a key that you're going to be taking, it'll interfere with PsychoPy's internal code. So never use escape. But you can use anything else you want. You can use ones, you can use letters, you can use whatever you want, essentially. For us, we're going to use space as our allowable key. Next, in terms of data, this is where you can specify what you want your keyboard component to store. As we will see later, it is possible for PsychoPy to code whether you have produced the right or wrong answer on a trial, and so you can store the correct answer. For a welcome screen, though, there is no correct answers. There's just a spacebar that needs to be pressed, so it won't make sense to look at that yet, but in my later videos, we'll address this. You can also specify what you want to be stored from the key presses. So when the keyboard object is going to end the routine, it doesn't really make sense to store anything but the last key that is pressed, because the last key is the only key that's going to get pressed. However, imagine that we had a trial that lasted 5 seconds and subjects could press maybe, let's say, 1, 2, 3, or 4. Note that you have to include every letter or key that you want to be pressable within the single quotes, and you need commas between them. If you mess up and you don't have the right quotes around things, you're going to get errors when you go to run your experiment. So make sure you're very careful here, putting the quotes and commas in the right spot. The commas go outside the quotes, and the quotes surround each key you want to be pressable. But let's say you had a trial where subjects had to rate things, and it was going to last 5 seconds, so they could press as many keys as they want. It's not going to end the routine. It might be interesting for you to store the last key that they pressed, meaning if a subject started the trial and they first pressed 1, then they changed their mind to press 2, then 2 gets stored, and you can look in your data file and you'll only see the very last key that was pressed. It might be interesting to you to store only the first key. So basically, if a subject presses 1 and then they change their mind and press 2, what gets stored in the data file is 1. The 2, the changing of your mind is not allowed. So it's only the first key that subjects press that is going to show up in your data file. On the other hand, maybe you want all the keys. Maybe you want to see the thought process. And so if a subject presses 1 and then they press 2 and then they go back to 1, you would like to see all 3 of those keys. And by selecting all keys, what you'll see in your data file is a list. So on that particular trial where subject pressed 1, then 2, then 1, you will see 1, 2, 1. And you'll know that subjects first pressed 1, then pressed 2, then pressed 1. PsychoPy also handily records the reaction time of each of those keys. So they'll tell you that the first key was pressed within a second of the trial starting, and the 2 came 3 seconds later, and then the 1 came half a second after that. So you can kind of get in the mind of your subjects and say, okay, they decided on 1, they pondered for a bit, and then selected 2, and then they quickly backtracked and selected 1 again. So you can sort of dissect their reaction times if that's what you want to do in your experiment by storing all keys. Now, by default, you typically only want one key response, and so last or first key is what you typically need. And if a routine is going to, if a keyboard response is going to end a routine, then last key is totally fine because, again, the last key is the only key that gets pressed. So we'll change this back to space. Note that it's space, not space bar, even though in my instructions I'm telling subjects space bar. Space is simply the keyword that PsychoPy uses for that key on the keyboard. Similarly to how the enter key is referred to as return. It is not referred to as enter. That won't work. It is referred to as return. So if you want the enter key, use the keyword return in single quotes. Okay, if we run our experiment now, then we will see our welcome message as we have before, but we won't be able to actually proceed with our experiment until we press spacebar. So we can sit here for as long as we would like, but until I press spacebar, which I'm about to do right now, our experiment won't start. And you see it starts as soon as you press spacebar. I'm going to press escape here to exit my experiment early. And again, that shows you why you don't want escape to be a key that you're using in your experiment. It will interfere and crash in all sorts of marvelous ways. Now, let's imagine that on our trial, we would like subjects to rate things. Maybe we would like subjects to provide some sort of pleasantness rating. So I'm going to add, in this case, a slider. And I will call this slider, I'll call it the fruit rating. Don't be afraid to have long variable names. It's, again, better to be descriptive. I mean, you don't want a whole paragraph here, but, you know, have something there. We can affect when the slider appears. Again, 0 will appear at the beginning of the trial. We could have it last infinitely, and we can have it force the end of the routine. I could also have it last for 10 seconds so that it lines up with the rest of the stimuli. And I could still have it force the end of the routine. So even though the trial will last 10 seconds, if you make a response in the slider, the trial will end early. You also have options here for ticks. So the slider will have numbers, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. This is where you can specify those ticks. You could also have, you know, 10, 20, 20, 30. You could have whatever you want. You could have 5, 10, 15, 20, 25. So you are in control of what you want the ticks on your scale to be. I'm just going to leave them as default. You can also give your ticks labels. So maybe rather than seeing 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, you want subjects to see unpleasant, you know, somewhat pleasant, neutral, you know, etc. So you can have labels, if you'd like, for your ticks. There's also this option for granularity. So a 0 means that subjects can select 1, they can select 2, and they can select everything in between. So they can select 1.112, you know, they can select any value on that slider. And we'll see that in a minute when I show you it in action. If you change the granularity to 1, however, then subjects can only select 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5. We'll start at 0, and I'll show you 1 afterwards. Other than that, we have the same parameters that we have seen elsewhere. Notice the slider by default appears near the bottom of the screen with a negative Y value. And that's fine for our purposes. You can affect the size of it, so how wide it is and how tall it is. You can affect things like the label color, the marker color, the line color. And there are even some interesting style tweaks. So change the appearance of the slider beyond its style. So for instance, you can have a triangle marker. By default, it's a circle marker. You can have labels, I believe, at a 45-degree angle. And you can change the font and the letter height and everything else. So a lot of the properties that you see in like text objects and images, they more or less repeat in various other objects. I mean, things are always a little different because every object, every component has its own unique properties that you don't see elsewhere. But nonetheless, things like position and size tend to be pretty universal, and all components tend to have these things. Let's start our experiment. And actually, my slide is not appearing. I think I messed up the time. Okay, in my case, it did not like having a stop time. So, I have a little mistake here. Notice, I mean, I should have caught this mistake before running my experiment. But notice, I thought I set it up to start at 0 seconds and last for 10 seconds. But it's not showing up on my routines timeline. If I go in here, I say, but wait, I selected stop in 10 seconds. But I accidentally clicked this menu. I must have scrolled it down when I kind of wasn't paying attention. And changed it from the default, which is durations in seconds, to something called condition, where you can specify certain conditions when things will end. These are advanced options, so you can have things stop after a certain number of frames or after at a certain time and so on. I'm going to change things back to duration, which is the default. And now there you go. You can see my rating has once again returned. And I'm going to uncheck force of end routine and click go. So now my slider will actually appear. And so there we go. And so again, you can see I can select any sort of value that I want. And notice it's not ending the routine. So I have a continuous scale and I could select any value that I want. If I go in and change the granularity to 1, and let's also force the end of the routine, we can see what happens when you have a slider scale where it's not continuous. So you're selecting whole values. And you can see, you can select this value or this value. You can't select in between. And once you make a selection, the trial ends. All right, the last input that we will look at today is the mouse. So when you're inserting a mouse component, it's a little more complex than just inserting a keyboard or a scale. The mouse component has to interact with other components that exist in your routine, and you basically have to list off what other components can actually be clicked on. So we'll call this the mouse response. And here what we're going to do is, again, give it a 10-second duration so it can last forever. Now, by default, when you make any click on the screen with your mouse, you will end the routine. Obviously, that's not what we want here. You can have it such that the mouse click never ends the routine. Once again, just like a keyboard response will never end a routine. Or you could give it a valid click. So basically, click on a specific target, and then the routine will end. So if we want to go with this route, allowing a specific click on a specific object to end the experiment, we need to actually specify what valid things can be clicked on. So here, under the Data tab, is where you can specify clickable stimuli. And what you are being asked for here is a list of components from your routine that can be clicked on. So for instance, how about image fruit? We're going to allow that to be something that can be clicked on. Now, it's very important that if you only have a single thing that can be clicked, you nonetheless end with a comma. If you only have a single item, PsychoPy is going to kick back an error to you because it's expecting a list here. So typically, you would have multiple things. You might have a few different components that people could click on. Maybe you just have one, however, and if you have one, make sure you have a comma at the end. There's also various options for what you can save here. So you can save, the state of the mouse on the click. This is very handy if you're not terminating the routine on a click. You can save every frame of mouse movement, so you can dissect how the mouse moved. You can also save time relative to the beginning of the experiment, to the routine, or in this case, the mouse onset, which is when the mouse was on the screen moving. We'll just leave everything else as default because this is just to demonstrate that you can actually get mouse responses. And so we're going to have to click on the fruit, and we're going to end our routine when we click on that fruit. So if we run our experiment now, once it starts up here, we will get our welcome screen. And now we can click wherever we want, but we got to click on that fruit. And when we do, we end the trial, we end the routine, and we end the experiment. So mouse responses, easy enough to add, but unlike keyboards where you specify what keys you can press, or scales where you specify the ticks of your scale, with the mouse component, you have to specify other components on your trial because those are the things that you're allowed to click on the screen because the mouse cursor is interactive with things that you see on your screen. So that wraps up our basic overview of PsychoPy for today. In our next video, we will be looking at more advanced overview features, including custom code, variables, and the difference between local and online experiments. If this video has been useful to you, don't forget to subscribe. And if you are in need of some PsychoPy help, I offer both consulting and programming services, the details of which are provided in the video description below. Don't hesitate to reach out if you need help. Thanks again for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.